Hello everybody, my name's Kerry Booth. I'm the Chief Executive of the Rural Services Network. I took over in April from Graham Biggs, who was one of the founding members of our organisation. So I'm relatively new in the position, but I've worked with the Rural Services Network for quite a long time. And before that, in 2 local authorities in Devon, which is where I live. Lots of us live all in amongst our rural communities. We're not London based as an organisation, so we live amongst your communities as well. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the campaigning work that we do and our work that focuses on rural policy and fair funding. I should say as well that we're also part of the National Centre for Rural Health and Care. We sit on meetings of the National Rural Crime Network, and we also support the Rural Housing Alliance. So there are various rural groupings focusing on different topics that we have our fingers in lots of these pies to make sure that we can influence from a rural perspective as well. So we have 9.7 million people living in our rural areas in England, which is more than 1/6 of the population. And yet government often fails to introduce policy that meets their needs. We represent rural services, therefore, to make sure that their voice is heard. We'll often see government come out with a policy saying, and this is designed to help our urban cities, towns and rural communities. But really, there's nothing in there that is going to help our rural communities and some of the challenges that they face. So primarily, the first thing that we do is campaign for fair funding for our rural communities and a fairer deal across public sector funding. But we're also about policy. We want to see not only a fairer distribution of resources, but for nuanced policy that reflects rural circumstances and the challenges that some of our residents face and the challenges that you will face in delivering services to them. We know, for example, in rural areas, people working in our rural economies earn less than those in urban areas. We have poor public transport links, expensive housing. All of these factors need taking into consideration when government is designing policy. So no doubt you'll have been attending lots of member induction events and learning about your corporate priorities. These are our corporate priorities, as it were, for our organisation. So at the top there, it's all about fair funding. We also do work and campaign around the rural economies, rural health and care, rural affordable housing and rural transport, all underpinned by net zero connectivity and rural planning, which cuts across lots of those issues. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about local government funding now, and I don't know how much you'll have known from what you've been learning so far, but government allocates funding. There's a very complex funding formula, which has various different blocks depending on whether you're a district, a county, how that gets influenced based on a million different factors. However, the way that they allocate funding to local authorities mean that urban areas get 38% more than rural areas per head in government funded spending power. That's significant when you guys start to think about, well, this is how much we've got as a budget, this is what we can focus on, this is what we can prioritise. Those urban areas are getting significantly more than you. Now, this is not a new thing. Underfunding by government has been going on for a long time, and you need to balance the books as a council. And so in rural areas, council tax has been put up over the years to help balance those books. What that means is your rural residents now are paying on average £110 more. That's about 20% more than those in urban areas for their services. So as an authority, you've got your budget at the start of the year, and your first call is on those statutory services that you have to provide. And once you've spent the money on statutory services, there's an amount left for discretionary services. This is where you focus on the needs of your communities and what's important to your rural communities. Well, as a result of that underfunding for rural areas, urban authorities have budgeted to spend almost double that of rural on discretionary services. Now, these are not just the nice to haves. Shall I get a takeaway on the weekend? These discretionary services really make an impact for your rural communities. So it is things like public toilets, community transport, libraries, leisure and park facilities. It is things like giving grants to citizens' advice, who actually then support some of the most vulnerable members of our community. We think that that's unfair. Our members think that that's unfair. And so what we do is represent that voice to government. We've been working with MPs for a number of years. There's just some example there of debates that we managed to get back in 2013, particularly when there was a lot of action on the local government funding formula. So we try and use MPs to pressurise government ministers to make changes to the formula. So, and this is where it does get a little bit technical. I'll send you these slides after the event, so don't worry about copying anything down. With this funding formula that government has, they did some consultation back in 2012 on changing the formula. so that there would be a redistribution of funds towards rural areas. They consulted on that, it was supported, it was implemented. However, so that there aren't big swings in funding from one urban council to rural, which might impact that urban authority's ability to balance budgets and to keep delivering services, they put in place a process called damping. This was meant to slowly release that money to the rural, well, to the councils who should have been receiving it over a number of years, just to help make that process seamless and for people to deliver services effectively. Unfortunately, the government then froze that process. So that damping process has been in place since 2012-13, and it has not changed. A number of things happened. We then went through Brexit, debates about that. We then went through COVID. Nobody wanted to rock the boat and change how services were being delivered. The government did its own consultation and own research looking at the additional cost of rural services. So there's two factors here. Rural councils are underfunded by government and it costs more to deliver services in rural areas. Just think about the refuse collection. Collecting from a terrace street of properties, you can do fairly speedily. Collecting from farms, which are maybe 2 or 3 miles apart, down country roads, takes up a lot more resources. So it costs more to deliver services in rural areas, and not just on things like buses and waste collection, but services around social care. There are often less markets, less competition for delivering some of those services, which can result in greater costs. So the government recognised the cost of delivering services in rural areas. It changed the formula, but because it froze it in place, and it's been frozen now for 10 years, those funds have not flowed through to rural areas. So there are councils, predominantly urban councils, receiving millions more at the moment than the government's own formula says they should, because these changes have been frozen in place. Now, as a result of lots of this work, we managed to get a grant put in place by the government. Originally, it was called ESSA, 2 S's in the middle there. It's now been renamed as the Rural Services Delivery Grant. It started off at 8.5 million and it went to those sparsest local authorities. That grant, as you can see, has grown over the years. And this is that 10 million Nadine was talking about. This year, from the provisional settlement being announced in December to the final settlement in February, we managed to get that increase by £10 million. So it went from 85 million to 95 million. So this grant goes to the most rurally sparsest populated authorities. And so that means in the whole course of that grant, we've got almost 700 million flowing to those rural councils as a result of the work and the lobbying work that we're doing. So it's not really a bad return for your membership fee. Unfortunately, that's not going to all rural councils yet. And so some of the work that we do is about pushing for that to be expanded, because we believe that all rural councils have those additional costs of delivering services. And we're continuing to campaign nationally on this. In the last few weeks, we met with the DLUHC civil servants, the officials, talking about the detail of that funding formula. Then I met with Michael Gove along with some council leaders to talk to him about the funding formula. I did a presentation on lots of these facts I'm talking to you about today. And we're now working on a campaign with rural MPs about how we really galvanise their efforts over the summer to put pressure on ministers ahead of that next provisional settlement that will be coming out in December. And we have a number of particular asks for them around the formula so that that damping is unfrozen and that money flows to our rural areas, and that the funding review, fair funding review they've been talking about for a number of years, can then take place. So this is our big push on rural fair funding. But we, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a number of other areas where we do work. So rural affordable housing. We know that wages earned in urban areas are higher than those in rural areas. The cost of living is higher in rural areas, and houses are less affordable in rural areas. You can see there the average sale price of a house in a rural area is over £100,000 more expensive than urban. So we've got all sorts of statistics around how much it costs to purchase housing, to rent housing in rural areas, and we're really struggling. We've also got the added implications for some of our rural areas around tourism and the impact that holiday homes, people changing to Airbnb rather than long-term lets, which takes those property out of the housing market for local people, and the impact of what that's having for our rural communities. Even right to buy. So if somebody's able to buy the property that they're living in, often that property is not replaced. For example, in a rural village, it might be replaced 50 miles away by that local authority, but actually that's really changing the makeup of our communities and people's ability to live within the communities where they're working and where their families are. So on affordable housing, we have a number of asks of government that we continually shaping. As government comes up with a new policy, we'll make sure that we're reflecting our needs on those. And we've got some detail here that you'll see when we send it to you. But really, you know, we're wanting them to produce a rural housing strategy, looking at how we can support people to live affordably in our rural communities. We'd like them to fund housing enablers for all rural local authorities for the next 5 years. I mean, they announced recently in Unleashing Rural Opportunity, they'd be putting 2.5 million in to that for the next year. I mean, that funds, I think, one per county area. I live in Devon, and the county of Devon is huge. It takes, you know, 2.5 hours to drive from one end to the other. So we're looking for those for all local authorities for the next 5 years, because positions like that can really make a difference in helping to get affordable homes in your local communities. Okay. The rural economy. Now, Nadine touched on this a little bit around, does the need for rural areas to be levelled up. So we did this research, or we commissioned the research. The government liked in its Levelling Up white paper to talk about regions. So we focused on, okay, let's consider rural as a region. We added together all those bits of rural across England. And as Nadine said, its need for levelling up is greater than any other part of the country. We know that productivity in rural areas is lower than the national average. And whereas the government at the moment keeps talking about the importance of raising that productivity, ending geographical inequality, which sounds fantastic. You know, when I read the Levelling Up white paper, I thought, brilliant, finally rural are going to get their fair share. Unfortunately, the reality has not happened like that since it's come out. We know as well that looking at statistics on a regional basis doesn't help our rural communities. So actually, we need to make sure that we're not missing those pockets of deprivation that exist within our communities. And just looking here, for example, at employment rates for 16 to 64-year-olds in some of the key, well, they're not key, but I like the Southwest, that's where I live. If you look at the Southwest, actually that has areas which have the lowest employment nationally and the highest employment nationally. So it's hard to take a picture and say, oh, this is what the Southwest needs, when its needs across the region are so different. And so we want government to actually be looking at the right measures, the right metrics at the right level. I'm not sure the employment rate is the best one. We know that in our rural communities, we have lots of people working in tourism, on low-paid jobs, seasonal employment. They may have 2 or 3 jobs, so the unemployment rate may be fairly low. That doesn't mean that work shouldn't take place in those areas to help improve productivity and job prospects and skills for those local people. That's just looking at one of the government's missions from the Levelling Up white paper, productivity, pay and employment. And on that one, rurals, they're in the top 3, but we're really not seeing action targeted for our rural communities on there. We know that, and we often refer to them as the rural economies. That's quite deliberate. We know that the economies across rural areas are very different depending on the geographical location and their nature. It's not all about agriculture, as important as that is. Actually, there's a whole range of businesses that work in our rural economies that we need to be making sure we're campaigning on their behalf with government. And there are challenges for the workforce here and challenges for employers and businesses as well around how they become more productive. That lack of affordable housing for our low-paid workers to live in, lack of transport to access skills, training, employment, lack of connectivity. And on the flip side, you know, those impact businesses, the lack of the workforce potentially that they could employ, lack of infrastructure, that broadband and mobile connectivity is a real key one for our rural economies. So we have a number of asks, and these are not all of them. I've just put a selection on the screen here. But firstly, around making sure we've got those measures and metrics at the right level, and it means that the deprivation in rural areas is not hidden. We think that we should be devolving decision making, you know, to our local people, so that because they know what's best for their local areas. And making sure that rural proofing is a real fundamental part of what happens when we design policies. So this is, for those of you who don't know, this is a bit like when you design a policy, you might need to do an equality impact assessment and make sure you've considered the needs of older people, younger people, people with disabilities in the design of that policy. And this is about us making sure that also when you design a policy, you've considered the needs of those that live in rural communities and whether the way that it's designed will disproportionately impact them, or do we need to make changes so that we have solutions that suit their needs. Transport. So I talked at the beginning there about how urban authorities budget to spend twice that of rural on discretionary services. When we look at transport, it's 5 times more. 5 times more they're spending on public transport. And we need transport to access post-16 education, employment. It might be an appointment at a doctor's surgery. It helps to reduce isolation. It means that we've got people in our rural communities who then have to rely on their private car to access these things. And that is expensive, especially when, like we have in last summer, fuel prices went up. You know, the government introduced the £2 bus cap fare, which is great if you've got a bus in your local community you can use to get somewhere. But if you don't, actually, it didn't really help you out. The government produced all sorts of strategies. I think back when it was having a lot of 3-word strategies, we had Bus Back Better, Build Back Better, all sorts of things. And it has lots of aims around how it wants to improve transport in rural areas. But one of the missions in the Levelling Up white paper was around getting the standards of transport across the country closer to that of London. I mean, I live in a village in Devon on the coast. I don't want my public transport to be at the same standard of London with a red bus coming through every 3 minutes. I just want my children to be able to get to school after 16. I want to be able to access my local shops. I want to be able to go to the doctor if I need to. And so we need to make sure that government understands that and designs policies so that it's appropriate to rural areas. I mean, it had bus improvement plans that it got all local authorities to design and put together. And actually the funding did not really go to all of our rural areas. We've got some councils who receive nothing out of those funding pots. We're waiting for the Future of Rural Transport strategy, which should be coming out. I mean, the urban one was published in 2019. We're a few years on from that, and we're hoping the government recently committed to finally publishing that strategy. So hopefully we'll see that strategy that actually meets those needs of rural communities and doesn't just talk about public transport around buses, but considers demand responsive transport. What do we do about electric vehicles? How do we make sure that our buses are suitable for the future and net zero? And is there an electric bus that can do a rural route without needing to stop and charge halfway along somewhere in the middle of nowhere? And what happens to those passengers and all of those implications? So we have a number of asks around transport. We'd love to see that transport strategy from government and really look at other options as well around, for example, a larger community transport funding pot, which is maintained over a number of years so that those kind of services can continue. Health and care. So we know in our rural areas we have an ageing population, and that places additional demands on delivering services. They often have greater need. We have quite a strange arrangement in our rural areas where our young people often leave once they finish school, heading to university, employment, all sorts of things in our urban areas. And then we have an influx of people as they're older, moving to our rural areas, which has those demands for services. And when you add that to isolation, a lack of public transport, you know, there's all sorts of implications that we can have in relation to our health and care services. We've actually had quite a few national reports that have come out on issues surrounding rural health. We had an EFRA committee that published a report on rural mental health in May 2023. And it said that rural communities' needs are not fully reflected in mental health policy and services and NHS planning. I mean, these are quite damning statements for our rural communities. Evidence was provided that said that rural areas face disproportionate problems in delivering care to the standards that people expect. It's hard to recruit staff, it's hard to retain staff in those rural areas, particularly when it's really hard to access affordable housing. Chris Whitty wrote a report on health in coastal areas and recognised that lots of those issues are similar to those in rural areas. And I read it because it was Chris Whitty, and we now, after COVID, we all know who he is and what job he does. But the report said the challenges of rural areas are distinct from those of urban, and they've received much less attention than they should have. So, you know, we're seeing a groundswell of reports and official reports coming out saying that the government really needs to do something to help support our rural areas, because all we're doing is building up issues for the future that we'll then struggle to address. So we have a number of asks. Obviously, that's what we do. We have a number of asks around rural health and care. We would like to see a workforce strategy that really targets those, you know, rural communities and how we recruit and retain people to work in health and care in our rural communities. We want to ensure, you know, we're all about the money and fair funding, that the whole range of extra costs in delivering service in rural areas are reflected in various funding formulas. So that includes public health, social care, and the NHS. I mean, I haven't even touched on social care as an issue in very much detail today, but we know that a lot of councils are struggling with the expanding costs of delivering social care in those rural communities. So these things are all underpinned by a number of areas that affect some of those cross-cutting issues. So net zero, and this is about, for example, transport, it's about heating our homes, recycling, it's about all number of things. We know, for example, from recent figures released that the fuel poverty gap in rural areas is now astronomical. It used to be around £500, and this is the additional income that a family needs to earn to get out of fuel poverty. It's currently around £956 in rural areas, and to give you a comparison, in London it's about 200. So that fuel poverty gap for our rural communities is significant. We know that we have a number of off-grid homes in rural areas, and the challenges of heating those are significant. And I think Nadine touched on this earlier, the government has a plan so that if you're off the gas grid and you're currently using fossil fuels, you have to transition to heat pumps as a heating source about 10 years earlier than those who are on the gas grid. And that puts you at a huge disadvantage. And I would say here, we're not anti-heat pumps at all, but to make a heat pump work in a property, you have to focus on fabric first. You have to make sure that that house is energy efficient, that it's not going to be leaking heat all over from the roof, the walls and the windows. And for our rural properties who may be single brick, single glazed, older properties in national parks, areas of natural beauty, actually even getting planning permission for some of those energy efficiency measures to take place is difficult. And the government will give you grants to put in, say, a heat pump system, which might cost you £5,000, but actually to make your home energy efficient, that could cost £30,000. You know, so we're at a real disadvantage for those rural residents having to do that around 10 years before everybody else should. So we campaign to make sure that rural are not overlooked. And this is an example of one of those government policies where they've not really thought about what the impact is for those rural residents. We want to make sure that our rural areas are not overlooked, but play a key role in this transition to net zero and can take part in the benefits of that. There's issues around the electricity network as well, and the resilience of that network in our rural areas, which we think should be a focus for action from the government. So there's a number of asks that we have around that. For example, on that heat pumps, we want them to commit to a heat pump ready first, not a rural first policy, and really make sure that they're not increasing duty or taxes on vehicle fuels, which disproportionately affect those rural communities who, have we said, rely on a car rather than public transport. Okay, digital connectivity. I had a couple of emails from people who are struggling to join the call today, and we know how important connectivity is for our daily lives. There's just some examples of all of the things that you may need to do online. In fact, that's my daughter, top left, back in those terrible days of homeschooling that I've blocked out of my mind now. But actually, accessing digital and our digital lives have become the norm these days. And if you don't have access to that, that can really put you at as a disadvantage. The government has some laudable missions. By 2030, we'll have nationwide gigabit capable broadband and 4G coverage. I mean, obviously there's an asterisk there because they don't quite mean nationwide. Actually, it means 95% of the landmass and 99% of premises, which sounds fantastic, apart from the fact that that 1% who's not getting it are really in our rural, hard to reach remote communities. And 1% doesn't sound much, but if you think that's almost 300,000 properties, that's huge. That's like an area like the size of Newcastle not having access in the same way that everybody else does. So we need to make sure that those rural areas are not left behind. The government has a number of initiatives in this area. The Shared Rural Network is doing some fantastic work. Project Gigabit is allocating funds to help what's happening in rural areas. They promised in that, for example, £5 billion to roll out this in rural areas, those areas not reached by private investment. So far, we've only seen 1.2 billion of that committed. So we'd love to see more of that from the government to really make a difference in what's happening. We have a number of asks around that, even things like we want them to review the universal service obligation, which at 10 megabits per second is out of date and inadequate for what most people do when they're at home working or for their businesses to be working. So we also want them to take action, you know, for those very hard to reach areas who are struggling to connect. Rural planning. So the work that we do around planning, we know that planning underpins all of those other priorities, and we often respond to government consultations. For example, we'll liaise with your planning department. We've done that recently on the changes to short-term lets and planning conditions and how that affects the housing market. So we often try to respond to government consultations on this to make sure that those implications for rural areas, which may be different to that of urban, are considered by government. Nadine mentioned our all-party parliamentary group. This is our cross-party group of MPs that we work with. That's the priorities they set themselves for this year: fair funding, net zero, transport and health and care, which does echo the work that we do and around our priorities. So we make sure that we're getting these messages to MPs and engaging with them in the work that we do. And that's just back to my final slide about how we will work on your behalf, fighting for a fair deal for rural communities. So thank